The house was abuzz with excitement. It was their youngest daughter Emma's birthday, and everyone had gathered to celebrate. Jacob, the father, seemed more cheerful than usual, his hearty laugh filling the room as he played with Emma. His wife, Rachel, moved around the house, orchestrating every detail, ensuring the party was perfect. To anyone watching, they were the picture of a perfect family. But beneath Jacob's laughter was a simmering storm. For months, he'd felt a growing distance between him and Rachel. She had become secretive, often staying out late with vague excuses. At first, he dismissed it as work-related stress, but when her phone buzzed constantly and she would leave the room to answer, doubt crept in. As the party went on, Jacob's gaze repeatedly shifted to Rachel, his mind replaying the events of the last few weeks. The moment he found an unfamiliar gold bracelet in her bag, the hushed conversations that abruptly ended when he entered the room. His suspicion had gnawed at him until he couldn't take it anymore. He had done something drastic, something that would either clear his doubts or shatter his world. Emma squealed with joy as she unwrapped her gifts, her big brown eyes lighting up the room. But Jacob's focus was elsewhere. His thoughts lingered on the DNA test results he'd taken in secret. He had used a sample from Emma's toothbrush and one of his own hairs. The envelope containing the results sat heavy in his pocket. Tonight, he would open it, and the truth would either set him free or destroy everything he held dear. The party finally wound down, and guests began to leave, their laughter and goodbyes echoing through the front door. Jacob stood by the window, watching the taillights fade into the distance. Behind him, Rachel was cleaning up, her movements brisk and mechanical. She hadn't noticed the tension radiating from him all evening, or maybe she was ignoring it. Once Emma was tucked into bed, Jacob decided it was time. He stepped into the living room, where Rachel sat scrolling through her phone, oblivious to the storm brewing in his mind. "Rachel," he said, his voice steady but cold. "We need to talk." She glanced up, startled. "What's wrong?" she asked, trying to sound casual, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes. Guilt? Fear? Jacob sat across from her, pulling the envelope from his pocket. "I found this," he said, placing it on the coffee table between them. "Do you know what it is?" Her eyes darted to the envelope, then back to him. "No," she said quickly, but her voice betrayed her. "It's a DNA test," he said, leaning forward. "I've had doubts for a while now, Rachel. About us, about Emma. And tonight, I'm done pretending everything is fine." Rachel froze, her face a mask of shock. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was deafening, heavier than the words Jacob had just spoken. "You did a DNA test without telling me?" she finally said, her voice rising. "How could you?" "How could I?" Jacob shot back, his calm demeanor cracking. "How could you, Rachel? The lies, the secrecy. I had to know the truth. And now I do." He tore open the envelope with a sharp motion, his hands trembling as he pulled out the results. His eyes scanned the page, and his heart sank. The words confirmed his deepest fear. Emma was not his biological daughter. Rachel's face turned pale as Jacob looked up, his eyes filled with a mix of betrayal and fury. "Explain this," he demanded, holding up the paper. "Who is Emma's father, Rachel?" Rachel's mouth opened, but no words came out. Her hands clutched the edge of the couch, knuckles white, as if the truth might dissolve if she held on tightly enough. But Jacob's piercing gaze wouldn't let her escape. "I asked you a question," Jacob pressed, his voice low and dangerous. "Who is Emma's father?" Rachel's lips quivered before she finally whispered, "It's not what you think." Jacob slammed his fist on the table, making her flinch. "Don't you dare give me that line. I have the results, Rachel. Stop lying." Tears filled Rachel's eyes and she buried her face in her hands. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen," she sobbed. "It was a mistake, a stupid, one-time mistake." Jacob's chest tightened. "A mistake? That's your excuse. Emma is 7 years old, Rachel. 7 years of lies. A mistake doesn't last that long." Rachel looked up, her face streaked with tears. "It was before we got married. I didn't know I was pregnant until after we tied the knot. I was scared, Jacob. I didn't want to lose you. I thought you'd never find out." Jacob recoiled as if struck. The woman he had loved, trusted, and built a life with had been deceiving him since the very beginning. "Who is he?" Jacob demanded, his voice like ice. "Tell me his name." Rachel hesitated, then whispered, "It's Matthew." The name hit Jacob like a sledgehammer. Matthew wasn't just anyone. He was Jacob's best friend, or at least he had been. The man who had stood beside Jacob on his wedding day, smiling in photographs. The man Jacob had confided in for years. Rage coursed through Jacob's veins. "Matthew? Matthew," he spat. "The man I trusted more than anyone? You've been lying to me for years, Rachel, and now I find out you were with him? You let me raise his child without ever telling me the truth?" Rachel sobbed harder, but Jacob didn't care. His mind was spinning, his chest tight with betrayal. He stood abruptly, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. "I need some air," he said, grabbing his coat and storming out of the house, leaving Rachel alone with her guilt and the weight of the truth. As Jacob walked into the cold night, his thoughts raced. He wasn't just angry, he was shattered. But beneath the fury, a plan was beginning to form. A plan to confront Matthew, to expose the truth, and to take back control of his life. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The next morning, Jacob didn't waste time. After a sleepless night filled with anger and bitter memories, he drove straight to Matthew's house. His knuckles turned white against the steering wheel as he replayed every moment of betrayal in his mind. Matthew's car was in the driveway, a polished reminder of the life Jacob had helped him build with his support and loyalty. That thought only fueled Jacob's rage. He stormed to the front door and pounded on it with enough force to shake the frame. After a moment, Matthew appeared, his face lighting up with a smile that quickly faltered when he saw Jacob's expression. "Jacob? What's going on?" "You know exactly what's going on," Jacob growled, shoving the DNA results into Matthew's chest. "Read it." Matthew looked confused, but he took the paper and began to scan it. As the realization hit, his face drained of color. He opened his mouth to speak, but Jacob cut him off. "Don't bother denying it," Jacob spat. "Rachel already told me. Emma is your daughter, isn't she?" Matthew stammered, his usual composure shattered. "Jacob, Save it!" Jacob shouted, his voice echoing through the quiet neighborhood. "You were supposed to be my best friend. You stood by me at my wedding, knowing you'd slept with Rachel. You let me raise your child while pretending to be my brother. How could you do this to me?" Matthew's shoulders slumped, guilt etched across his face. "It wasn't supposed to happen," he said quietly. "It was a mistake, a moment of weakness. I thought Rachel had moved on, that it was over. I never meant for you to find out." Jacob laughed bitterly, the sound devoid of humor. "A moment of weakness? Is that supposed to make this better? You both lied to me for years, Matthew. Do you have any idea what that's done to me?" Matthew looked at him, his guilt now mixed with a flicker of defiance. "You're right," he admitted. "We made a mistake. But Emma doesn't deserve to suffer because of it. She's your daughter in every way that matters. You're the one who's been there for her, not me." Jacob's jaw clenched. The words cut deep because they were true. He had been the one to rock Emma to sleep during storms, to teach her to ride a bike, to celebrate her victories and comfort her defeats. No test result could erase the bond they shared. But the betrayal still burned. Jacob pointed a finger at Matthew. "You don't get to tell me what Emma deserves. You lost that right the moment you betrayed me. Stay away from my family, Matthew. If I ever see you near Rachel or Emma again, I swear you'll regret it." Without waiting for a response, Jacob turned and walked away, his heart heavy but his resolve firm. He had one more thing to do, to protect Emma, to protect the life he had built, and to decide what to do about Rachel. The battle wasn't over, but Jacob was ready to fight for the truth and for justice. Jacob returned home, his mind racing with conflicting emotions. As he opened the door, he found Rachel sitting on the couch, her face pale and tear-streaked. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and desperation. "Where were you?" she asked softly. "I went to see Matthew," Jacob replied coldly, throwing his coat onto a chair. "He admitted everything. I warned him to stay away from you and Emma." Rachel's shoulders sagged, but her expression remained tense. "Jacob, I know I hurt you. I know I've ruined everything. But Emma doesn't deserve to lose you. She loves you, and you're the only father she's ever known." Jacob's heart twisted at the mention of Emma. He thought about her innocent smile, the way she hugged him tightly every night before bed, and the bond they had shared for 7 years. None of this was her fault. "Emma's my daughter," Jacob said firmly, his voice steady. "No DNA test can change that. But you," he paused, his eyes narrowing at Rachel. "You've broken something between us that I don't know can ever be fixed." Rachel's eyes brimmed with tears. "I'll do whatever it takes, Jacob. I'll go to therapy. I'll give you space. Anything. Just don't give up on us. Don't give up on our family." Jacob stared at her, his emotions a storm inside him. Part of him wanted to believe her, to hold on to the life they had built. But the betrayal was a wound too deep to ignore. "I don't have an answer for you right now," he said finally, "but I need time to think. This isn't something I can forgive overnight, Rachel." If ever Rachel nodded, her tears falling silently. She seemed to understand that this was as close to a second chance as she was going to get. That night, as Jacob lay in bed, he couldn't sleep. His mind kept replaying everything, the lies, the betrayal, and the way his life had unraveled in just a matter of hours. He knew one thing for certain. He wouldn't let Emma be caught in the crossfire. She deserved better than that. Morning came, and Jacob had made a decision. Over breakfast, he looked at Rachel with a new resolve in his eyes. "I'm staying for Emma," he said. "She deserves a stable home, and I won't take that away from her. But as for us, I can't promise anything, Rachel. You'll have to earn my trust back, if that's even possible." Rachel nodded, her face etched with remorse. "I'll do whatever it takes," she whispered. Jacob glanced at Emma, who was happily munching on her cereal, blissfully unaware of the storm around her. He knew the road ahead would be long and painful, but for her sake he was willing to take the first step. But deep down, Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. Matthew's betrayal, Rachel's lies, they were like cracks in a dam, threatening to burst at any moment. And when they did, Jacob would have to decide once and for all whether his family could be salvaged or if it was time to let it go. Weeks passed and life in the household took on a fragile normalcy. Jacob stayed for Emma's sake, but the air between him and Rachel was heavy with unspoken tension. Every smile at the breakfast table, every shared glance across the room was shadowed by the weight of what had happened. Rachel tried to make amends, going out of her way to prove her remorse, but Jacob remained distant. One evening, as Jacob was helping Emma with her homework, his phone buzzed. It was an anonymous message containing just one line. "You deserve to know everything." Attached was a series of photos and a video. Jacob hesitated before opening them, his gut twisting with dread. When he finally did, his world tilted. The photos showed Rachel and Matthew together, not from years ago, but recently. One picture was dated just a month before Emma's birthday party. The video was a short clip of them at a cafe, laughing and holding hands. Jacob's hands trembled as he stared at the evidence. This wasn't just a one-time mistake from the past. It was ongoing. Rachel had continued the affair, even after everything they had been through. Anger flared like a wildfire inside him. He stood abruptly, startling Emma. "Finish up, sweetheart," he said, forcing a calm tone. "I'll be back in a bit." Without giving Rachel a chance to notice his mood, Jacob walked out of the house, his mind racing. The betrayal was deeper than he'd imagined, and the anonymous message hinted that someone else knew their secrets. But who? He drove aimlessly for a while before pulling over to gather his thoughts. His mind kept circling back to the message. Who had sent it, and why now? A chilling thought occurred to him. What if it was Matthew? What if this was his way of taunting Jacob, of rubbing salt in the wound? But as Jacob replayed the message in his mind, another possibility struck him. Someone else might know the truth, and they were using it to manipulate him. When Jacob returned home, Rachel was waiting for him, a concerned look on her face. "Where did you go?" she asked softly. Jacob's jaw tightened. He stared at her, the images from the message flashing in his mind. But he didn't confront her. Not yet. He needed answers first, and he needed to figure out who was pulling the strings. "I went for a drive," he said curtly, brushing past her. That night, as Rachel slept, Jacob sat in the living room, staring at the message on his phone. The betrayal was no longer just a crack in their marriage, it was a chasm. And whoever had sent that message had thrown him into the middle of a game he didn't fully understand. But Jacob wasn't about to let himself be a pawn. He would uncover the truth, no matter how deep the rabbit hole went. And when he did, there would be no mercy for anyone who had betrayed him,